The UK is sliding into an avoidable crisis, according to a major review into workplace sickness out this morning. The Keep Britain Working review found that since 2019, 800,000 more people have left the workforce due to ill health. That's currently costing employers an estimated £85 billion a year.
The review warns that without action, it's going to get worse, estimating 600,000 more are going to drop out of work by 2030 unless there's an intervention. OK, well, let's talk to the person who's led this review. He used to head up John Lewis, Sir Charlie Mayfield. The report was commissioned by the government. It's obviously a huge problem. What is the problem? Why are so many of us out of work because of sickness?
So, morning. Great to be on, and thank you for having me. It's the issue is that more people are getting ill. We're getting older and we're getting sicker sooner, and we're not handling that as well as we could in the workplace. And it's really important that we do. And I think the message in the review, on the one hand, I want to make people realise there's a big problem, and we're really clear about that. But the other message I want to get across is there's also a real opportunity to fix this. And I feel this is a very serious but very fixable problem.
Is it what you might call a sick note culture or a fit note culture taking over, which is that GPs are just signing people off work and employers just have to deal with that, and they don't know how to combat that idea that it's OK to be sick and off work?
Well, do you know, I think it's wrong to... There are issues with the way the fit note system works, but it's wrong to pin it on that. I think, more accurately, we've kind of ended up in a situation which no one really wants. And, the great, fantastic thing about doing a review like I've been able to do over the last several months is I've been all around the country talking to people and seeing what's going on. And what I can see is there's pieces of the answer pretty much everywhere you go. There's people doing amazing stuff, but we're not joining it all up very well. And so what we need to do is take a system-wide approach, fix that, and then actually we can make some dramatic improvements. One of the issues that we have found is there's a lot of fear when it comes to ill health. A lot of people who have a health condition are generally afraid of telling their employer about that. And actually a lot of employers are afraid of talking to their employees about health issues. And partly because they don't want to cause offence, they don't want to do something wrong, all those kinds of things. The problem with that fear, though, is it creates distance. And just at the point when you really need people to be talking to each other, you have distance. And of course, that doesn't help anything. And then the fit note can exacerbate that problem. The good news is that there are lots of examples where we've seen completely the opposite. I was in Bolton several months back at a clinic that was run by Nuffield. They're running a joint pain clinic. And instead of having people who've got joint pain going home and being sent home with their pain and having to sort of suffer in silence and let's face it, getting down, if you're hurting, it does get you down. Instead, they put a dozen people in the room together twice a week with a physio. They were all slightly in love with their physio, I have to say. But the main point was that because they all came together and they all had joint pain issues, they were empowered by that. These people were on fire. And it was fantastic to see. So there are real solutions out there. We just have to join this thing up better, and we can make a big, big difference.
It's interesting you say that. I can imagine somebody who, wasn't receiving that kind of treatment, because you have to deal with this on a case-by-case basis. Somebody saying, actually, does it sound a bit like you're asking employers to put pressure on those who are suffering pain? If I can't work because I've got chronic joint pain, are you going to put me in a room with a physio until I'm sort of fit enough to work?
Yeah, so look, this is why when you're talking about this, it is kind of complicated, and of course there's a whole range of issues. And so, in a short clip like this, I have to talk more generally, yes. And there will always be instances that you've got to be very careful about. But on the whole, staying active, staying in work is actually good for health. And it's really, really in people's interest to stay active, to stay well, and to stay in work, just for their own prosperity and for their long-term sort of prospects. If people end up coming away from work and becoming isolated, what very often happens is they actually get iller. What starts with one condition becomes two, can become three. So we really do have to try and keep people in work as much as we can. And if we can do that, everybody will win. We'll go from a position where sort of everyone is losing and no one really wants this to a position where many more people will feel that they're better supported and actually we can achieve more.
Can I ask you about the budget and this issue? Because what you're saying is quite similar to some things that Pat McFadden, the Work and Pensions Secretary, said to us a couple of weeks ago. There's been a massive rise in the last 5 years in young people who are now on long-term sickness, not in work, because of mental health issues, up 76%. As you say, a lifetime out of work costs the taxpayer, but it's also really bad for people's well-being, their lives, their earning. I think the government is thinking, should we say to young people who have a mental health condition, they've had a note from the GP, that shouldn't be a reason to stop working. You actually ought to be looking for work and taking the right kind of job. Is that an approach that you would recommend? Saying to young people with a mental health issue, fine, but you need to go to work?
So just notwithstanding what I said to Susanna, which is you've got to be careful about generalising, there is a lot of evidence that says that, particularly with mental health, one of the worst things you can do is isolate people and have them alone at home with their mental health issue. One of the best things you can do is keep people in a community where they're engaging and they've got social interaction. So keeping people in work while they are recovering from or they're dealing with some kind of mental health issue is often actually really important part of getting better and recovering from it. So just signing people off is not a good idea. But I think what we have to think about is we have to kind of think about the person. Imagine that young person who's maybe they're not terribly confident. They don't quite know how they're going to get on. They're coming into work for the first time. They've never been in work before. They don't know whether they're going to belong, whether they're going to like the people they're working with, whether they're going to be good at what they do, even what they have to do. You know, you've got all those insecurities there. Now, what we all hope for is that that person gets onto a kind of rising tide where they get a bit better, you know, they get a bit more confident, they start feeling like they belong, and they start rising. And the good news about that is that's the sort of track that many of us have been fortunate to be on. But there are other people who find that they don't get that, and they get a bit knocked back, and they have another knockback and another knockback, and they end up on a slippery slope. And that's what ends up sometimes with people ending up in the welfare system. Employers have an opportunity.
Sorry, I just want to put to you something that we have received this morning from the Disability Rights UK policy lead on your review. And it's quite critical. So this is from Mikey Earhart. Yet another government-commissioned report blaming disabled people for not working. Your report has a focus on fixing disabled people, but you can tell that he wasn't listening to the community because it's so rife with medical model-focused language, fundamentally misunderstands that people are disabled by societal and workplace barriers, not just by their health conditions. What do you think about that? That actually there is a whole sort of group of disabled people who think that you've misunderstood. They're in jobs which are predominantly poorly paid, strenuous, insecure, not in jobs where you're lucky enough to have a Nuffield health physio in the same room as you who's fixing your pain.
So one of the things we have said in the review is that actually disabled people face particularly, they are subject to some particular disadvantages in the context of today's work. So I don't accept that we've sort of somehow ignored that or we're trying to group them in. I'd also say that we've spent a lot of time talking to disabled people's organisations, indeed, including this week, and engaged very closely, and a lot of disabled people. It's one of the first things we did in the review was spend time with people with lived experience, because it's so important to understand that. So actually, within the review, I think we've got many proposals, and this is the danger of generalising on this, is you can end up upsetting some people because you're not talking about them specifically. In the context of what they're talking about, there are various models for how you deal with disability. There's a social model, which I think is a very good one. Basically, it's about removing social barriers that mean that disabled people find it hard to get into work. There's a medical model, which is basically treating them as a medical condition. If you're disabled, you're not ill, you have a disability. There's also a thing called biopsychological model. And that sort of combines all of these elements. It takes the behavioural aspects and the social aspects and says, how do you go about creating better arrangements so people can really thrive in work? And I think what we have to look at is particularly the social model and also the broader consideration of the behavioural aspects so that we can create more opportunities and keep people in work. I have met some extraordinary people who are amazingly resilient and frankly deserve to be in work. And you know, one of the things we've called out in the review is that when you look at some groups, some people who are disabled are facing effectively structural exclusion from the workplace. And I would agree with the person who's written to you that that is a big problem.
Yeah, that does seem to be an agreement. OK, Sir Charlie Mayfield, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Keep Britain working.